We have now the person who has put together the first full biography of Montgomery Bell, and that is John Williams, who's done an exceptional job. I promise you it's really exceptional because I read the book. And here he is, John Williams.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. So thank you so much, Gene, and it's a delight to be here with so many history lovers as well as several old friends and a few MBA fellow graduates. And so this is the fellow we're going to talk about for the next hour, Montgomery Bell. He lived a very long life, 86 years. He was born in 1769 up in Pennsylvania and died in Tennessee in 1855. So he really did live a very long and productive life. As you'll see from some of the slides in the book and also in this presentation, I've tried to integrate a little bit of history along with the story of Montgomery Bell's life. So you can get a little flavor of some of the places where he lived during his long life. So I want to start with a description of Montgomery Bell, which was written by a man named Rick Hollis, who I met for the first time while I was doing research for this book. Rick is a native of Charlotte, Tennessee, not North Carolina, in Dickson County, the county seat of Dickson County. Rick is about 65, I think. He's a businessman and a historian, and he knows more about Dickson County history than I will ever hope to learn. And so I drew on his expertise a lot. He was also back in 2003, which was the bicentennial of Dickson County. It had been formed in 1803. And so they had a booklet that came out that Rick was the chairman of the Bicentennial Commission for that event. And so he wrote a lot of articles, and there was a really colorful brochure or booklet that came out. And he wrote a little profile, if you will, of Montgomery Bell. And I want to read the description that he included in that profile because it's the best description of Montgomery Bell that I was able to find. So this is how he described Montgomery Bell: tall, handsome, steely-eyed, shrewd, crafty, firm, energetic, creative, imaginative, sophisticated, but unpretentious. Montgomery Bell was Tennessee's first capitalist and industrialist and the South's greatest ironmaster. And if you're wondering why I decided to call the book Montgomery Bell, Tennessee Frontier Capitalist, because capitalist is a word that maybe has different meanings to different connotations to different people. But Montgomery Bell thought of himself as a capitalist. And in the advertisements and notices that he would put in the local newspapers when he was advertising his properties, goods that he made, lands that he owned for sale, he would begin the top of the advertisement by saying, "Men of capital attend," meaning come and see what we've got to offer here. And so he really thought of himself as a capitalist. And I thought, if he were critiquing the book about his life, he would like the fact that he was described as a frontier capitalist. So let's talk a little bit about his background, if I can figure out how to use my tool here. So he was from Chester County, Pennsylvania. And Chester County was one of the three original counties. It's in the southeastern corner of the state, as you'll see. It's located down there. It borders both Delaware and Maryland. And the guy who gave it was William Penn, who some of you may recognize his picture there. And so he acquired a land grant, if you will, from King Charles II, who, by the way, before our current King Charles III was the king that used the name Charles. So our current king is the one right after King Charles II who made the land grant to William Penn for Pennsylvania. So first we'll talk a little bit about two of the things that really caught my attention about Chester County, Pennsylvania. We've all heard of the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, we've heard about that all our lives. It's the dividing line between the North and the South. But who ever stopped to think, why do they call it the Mason-Dixon line? Well, I found the answer. And basically, when William Penn's descendants, they had a dispute with the descendants of Cecilius Calvert, who was the man that King Charles II had made a land grant for the area that's now Maryland. And so they had a dispute over where the boundary line was. And the descendants inherited the dispute. And they'd had it for years and years and years. And they decided finally, around 1760, that they were going to settle it and draw the boundary line where it should be. And so they hired these two English surveyors by the name of Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. And they were world-renowned surveyors, and they were actually astronomers in addition to being surveyors. And so they came over and camped out in Pennsylvania for a total of 5 years while they, in essence, ran the line that has ever since been the Mason-Dixon line. And they used as a reference point a stone that became known as the Stargazer's Stone. And there it is. It's got a rock wall around it now, and I had the opportunity to visit it and see it's on private property, but there's an easement that allows people to walk across the property and see it. And so that was pretty neat. That was the reference point that Mason and Dixon used to draw the Mason-Dixon line. And they placed those little stones. Now that stone that you see in that picture has been there since about 1765. And there were stones like that a mile apart, all along the Mason-Dixon line. And so it took several years to run the line and to place those stones. But I thought that was pretty neat. Whoops. So the second most interesting historical fact about Chester County is that Lincoln University is located in the southern part of Chester County. And Lincoln University, which was originally known as the Ashmun, A-S-H-M-U-N, Ashmun Institute, is the first historically black college and university in the country. It was actually founded in 1854, before the Civil War, and it was named for a man named Jehudah Ashmun, who was an African-American pastor that went in the first half of the 20th century, in the 1820s. He went to Liberia, where emancipated slaves were being taken by the American Colonization Society, and he went there to minister to these relocated, emancipated African Americans that were going there to live. And so when they decided to form this college that was specifically for African Americans, they named it initially for him, Ashmun Institute. And after the Civil War, they decided to rename it after Abraham Lincoln. So it became Lincoln University.
The Barn art collection was originally given. It's now in Philadelphia.
I don't know the answer to that. But the most well-known graduate of Lincoln University is Thurgood Marshall. So now let's talk a little bit about Montgomery Bell's early life. So as I said, he was born in 1769. He was the youngest of 10 children that were born over a period from 1745 to 1769. So think about his poor mother. But large families were very common in those days, and so it was not uncommon that there would be 10 children in the family. What was uncommon was that they were a very healthy group. All 10 lived to adulthood. So, I mean, he basically had 9 siblings throughout most of his adult life. So the other thing that struck me as being interesting about his life is that being born in 1769, that was 6 years before the start of the Revolutionary War. He died in 1855, 6 years before the start of the Civil War. So in a very real sense, his life was sort of bookended by those 2 wars. So he lived on a road called Gumtree Road, which is still there. And I did some research in the Chester County Archives, and it was called Gumtree Road back during his lifetime, I think because there was a gum tree that was located, and that was kind of the reason that it got its name. But what's even more fascinating is that the home that he lived in during the period of like the 1770s and 1780s is the stone house that you see there. It's been added on to, obviously, but it's still standing and it's still used as a residence. The owner owns a nursery, a tree nursery, right next door, on the property right next door to this, and he owns it and actually rents it out now. And he was very nice. The people that lived there were at home, and so he thought perhaps not such a good idea to go tramping through it. But anyway, I was able to see it from the outside. And so it's remarkable, that the house that he grew up in is still there and serving as a residence.
Did the present owners, were they aware of who Montgomery Bell?
They were not. And I was able to determine that this was the home after quite a bit of search. And so the guy who owns the nursery and owns the house was interested to learn that, Okay, so here's another historic house that's still standing. This house is located, this belonged to Patterson, his older brother that was perhaps the most successful of all his siblings. And this is located in Lancaster County, which is the adjacent county to Chester, and it's used for fundraising events now. It's not actually occupied on a regular basis, but the local historian who drove me around Chester County said that they frequently have fundraising events in the house that was owned by Patterson Bell.
Kim had to think of that desire.
So another very, very old building that's a church, and there's a creek in Chester and Lancaster, runs through Chester and Lancaster County, both called Octorara Creek. And this is the Middle Octorara Presbyterian Church. Montgomery Bell and his whole family were staunch Presbyterians. And so this church is actually located in Lancaster County, and Patterson, whose house we just saw, when he moved to Lancaster County, started attending this church. And the little graveyard right next to it is where John Bell, Montgomery Bell's father, is buried, and has a very, very nice inscription on his tombstone, which I quoted in the book. And so this church here is the church that Montgomery Bell and his family attended in Chester County, and it's called the Manor Presbyterian Church. And as you can see, it's still there. It was actually built, there's a little plaque on the outside that shows it was built in 1730. So it's been there a very, very long time. So a little more, before we move to Kentucky, a little more about his life. So again, he grew up during the middle of the Revolutionary War. 4 of his older brothers fought in the Revolutionary War. He was, basically too young to fight, but he supposedly, so one or more of those brothers spent the winter of 1777-78 with George Washington at Valley Forge. And the family lore is that he visited Valley Forge during that winter to see his brother. His parents, John and Mary Bell, were friends with George and Martha Washington. And again, family lore is that George and Martha Washington stayed with the Bells in that home that we saw on a couple of occasions. His brother, John Bell, wrote the first, if you will, sort of magazine article description of George Washington and in 1780. And so it was right in the middle of the Revolutionary War, and it was published in a magazine in Britain. And so it was really the way that readers of this magazine in Britain got some idea of who this guy George Washington was, that they were, that their troops were fighting in America. There were 2 battles that took place in Chester County. One was Brandywine, which is fairly well known by students of the Revolutionary War, and the other was a place called Paoli. Those were both in Chester County. So Montgomery Bell was homeschooled, just didn't have schools. There was no school system in those days in the 1770s and 1780s. And so he was homeschooled. Fortunately, he had those 9 siblings and 2 parents that were very attentive. So I think he learned a lot through his homeschooling. After the Revolutionary War was over, he was apprenticed to 2 different brothers. First to his brother Patterson, who owned a tannery where leather was made. And he apprenticed with his brother Patterson for 3 years, a tanner's apprentice. And those of you that know about tanneries, they're pretty stinky. They really just have a horrible odor attached to them. And I don't think he much took to that. So his other brother, Zachariah, owned a hattery, was what made hats. And so Montgomery apprenticed to him for a short period of time, I think only several months. But he learned the hat business through apprenticing to his brother. And so in 1789, so he would have been 20 years old at that point, one of his sisters, Elizabeth, she and her husband lived in Cecil County, Maryland, which was right across the border from Chester County, Pennsylvania. And so they had decided to move to Kentucky, near Lexington, Kentucky, where he had acquired a fairly large tract of land. People were moving west in those days, and west meant Kentucky in those days. It didn't mean any farther west than that. And so they moved to Lexington, and the husband of his sister Elizabeth promptly dies. And so by that time they had 6 children. And so there was Elizabeth, Bean was her last name, in Lexington with 6 children. And so she called on her family for assistance, and that's what caused Montgomery to move to Lexington, Kentucky. He was sort of the family member that answered the call. And so he spent his next 10 years in Lexington in Fayette County. You can see that shows it was in eastern Kentucky. Kentucky at that time, if those of you that know your history pretty well will remember that 1789, Kentucky was still a part of Virginia. It had not yet become a state. In fact, Tennessee had just become a state. Tennessee became a state after Kentucky. Kentucky became a state in 1792, and then Tennessee in 1796. But when he moved there, it was still a part of Virginia.
That's why they're both commonwealths.
And I don't know why that is, Bob. That's a great question.
Virginia is a commonwealth.
There are 4 commonwealths.
So's Kentucky.
And Massachusetts, and there's one other that are Pennsylvania, right? So there are 4. I'm sorry.
I'm saying in Connecticut.
I think they're just 4. So the best known resident of Lexington at that time and for many years to come was Henry Clay. And his law office has been nicely preserved. You can see the historical marker there, and I think open only occasionally to the public. So Montgomery Bell and Henry Clay did business. Henry Clay, I think, may have represented Bell as a lawyer on some things, but basically they engaged in some land transactions together and even were on opposite sides of a couple of lawsuits. So not surprising, I think. So hats were big business in those days, and those of you that have seen Revolutionary War movies and photographs know that the tricorn hat was, the favored hat of that period. And so that was the type of hat that Montgomery Bell made at his hattery, which was the largest, apparently the largest hat shop west of the Allegheny Mountains. He employed 20 people making hats in his hat business, and he also made beaver hats, which was another perhaps more fashionable. I think the tricorn hat was more commonly worn by people. The beaver hat was worn perhaps by more stylish folks. So he advertised in the local newspaper, and through newspapers.com, I was able to find a lot of newspaper ads and notices that he put in. So you can see that was the way that he let people know that his hats were for sale. Very, elegant hats. This was an upscale hat shop that he ran. So the other thing that to me was interesting in light of his leaving a bequest for the formation of Montgomery Bell Academy much later in life is that even that early in his life, when he was in his 20s, he was interested in funding educational institutions. And so there were two that he helped to fund while he was living in Kentucky. One was, you all may be familiar with a university located in Lexington called Transylvania University, still there, fine university. Well, so they were just getting started at the end of the 18th century. And so they called on some of the wealthier business people in Fayette County, and Jessamine County was the county just south of Fayette County where he owned a lot of land as well. And so they called on some of the leading businessmen to provide funds to start a law school and a medical school at Transylvania University. And Montgomery Bell was one of the people that contributed to that. And then the second thing, and this, you won't be able to read this notice, but basically it says Young Ladies Academy. And so that was something that he collaborated with a man named James Stevens, whose name you'll see at the bottom of the notice there. I think James Stevens put this notice in describing what was basically a high school that they were trying to create for young girls. Now, why would Montgomery Bell have had an interest in this? Probably because of his sister's children. His sister had 3 daughters that were, of that age, and he thought it would be good for them to be able to have an education. So although Montgomery Bell Academy ended up being an all-boys school, I think he had an interest in education of young girls as well as boys. So I thought that was really interesting, that his interest in funding education started in Kentucky. So he moves around the beginning of the 19th century to Tennessee. So he moves to Dickson County, Tennessee, which is where most of his iron furnaces and forges were located, and that's where he sort of got his start in the iron business. The person that he went into business with, and actually was employed by, I think initially, was James Robertson, one of the founders of Nashville. James Robertson had built the Cumberland furnace, which was the first iron furnace in Middle Tennessee. There were some in East Tennessee. But Montgomery Bell moves here, probably went to work for James Robertson, maybe part-time around 1800, 1801, 1802, and then moves to Tennessee full-time in 1802. And in 1804, he actually buys the Cumberland furnace from James Robertson. So that was his first furnace in Tennessee. So first, let's do a little Dickson County history. Dickson County, as I said a minute ago, was formed in 1803 by the Tennessee legislature. Montgomery Bell had just moved here then, and so they obviously, the state legislators and the local business people recognized him as being a man of prominence. And so he was, along with those other folks on that historical marker, were the members of the initial county court, which was the sort of legislative body for Dickson County. And they had their first meeting at a home which that historic marker denotes. So you probably recognize this gentleman here, probably the most famous person other than Montgomery Bell from Dickson County, governor of Tennessee for 10 years back in the 1950s and 1960s, a racial moderate in a period of some upheaval in the South. And then the next person, you may not know that he was from Dickson County. Big O, Oscar Robertson, is from Bellsburg, Tennessee, which is located in Dickson County. And his grandparents, who he lived with, were Mr. and Mrs. Early Bell. They were descended from some of the enslaved workers that worked at Montgomery Bell's iron furnaces. And so Oscar Robertson, who's still living, by the way, he's in his 80s, comes, according to Rick Hollis, who I mentioned earlier, he comes back about once or twice a year to visit with some of his cousins and friends, and really, cherishes his early days in Dickson County in Bellsburg. So let's talk about iron for a minute here. So this, you may not be able to read all of this, but you can sort of see the pictures about how charcoal was made. So there were three basic ingredients, if you will, at his iron furnaces. There was iron ore, obviously was the first. Charcoal was the second, and charcoal was how the iron ore was reduced to a liquid form. And the third was limestone, which combined with the other two to remove some of the impurities, if you will, that were attached to the iron ore. Iron ore is not pure at all. It's got all these impurities attached to it. And so the limestone helps to remove it. We'll see in a minute how that worked. But this shows how they made the charcoal. No Walmart, no Target for them to go to buy bags of charcoal. They had to make the charcoal from scratch. And that's why they needed so much timber. And that's why Montgomery Bell, placed his iron furnaces and forges in areas that had huge amounts of timber around the furnaces where, the wood choppers could chop down the trees and they would take them. And in the middle of what looks like a little hut there was where the charcoal was sort of simmered, if you will, to make it into a usable charcoal form.
Did he know about all the limestone in the Middle Tennessee?
I'm sorry?
Did he know about all the limestone?
Absolutely, and that was another thing that made Dickson County and the surrounding counties attractive to him, was because of all the limestone deposits, as well as all the timber and the iron ore, all three of the ingredients. So if you can imagine it, this is an example of a hut that the colliers, are y'all familiar with the term colliers? So, that's actually a last name that I think some people I know in Dickson County and around have. And so colliers were people that made the charcoal, and they lived in these huts while the charcoal was simmering in those, what you saw in the previous picture. And I mean, doesn't look like a very inviting place. I said in the book that it was kind of like they lived like hermits, basically, in those little sheds there. And so when the charcoal was finished, it would be hauled by teamsters, they were called teamsters, in those wagons, and they would be hauled to the site of the iron furnace or forge, and it would be stored, the charcoal would be stored for some period of time. And basically the furnace or forge was powered by water power with that water wheel that you can see there. And this picture was taken at the Hopewell furnace in Pennsylvania. And Tennessee, to its everlasting shame, has not preserved any of the existing iron furnaces from that period of time. Pennsylvania has, and Pennsylvania has a couple of just excellent sites. One is the Cornwall furnace, and this is the Hopewell furnace, which is a National Park Service run site, so that you can actually see. So this is the top of the Hopewell iron furnace, and they would bring across the walkway there, they would bring the ingredients, and that was sort of the chimney that they would load it into. And then this is the bottom of that same furnace. And so that gives you kind of a bird's eye view of how an iron furnace, this was an actual iron furnace that has been preserved over the years and now is open to the public. So here's a diagram that you can see that sort of shows, you can see the wagon hauling the charcoal over to where it was deposited. Another sort of diagram that shows how the various, so it was like 30 feet down that the ingredients fell to the bottom. And then at the bottom, it would run out into either, it would become what was called pig iron, which were these bars of iron that were still kind of rough, that were kind of like dumbbells in a way, like dumbbells used for weightlifting. And then there were casts, C-A-S-T-S, of various, dinnerware use, pots and pans and kettles and so forth, there were casts of those. And so the liquid, after it had been heated and ran out the bottom, would run into those casts. And so literally at his furnaces, there were objects that were created that were later sold. But mostly there were pig iron bars that were created, and they were further refined at forges. So the difference between a furnace and a forge, the furnace was the first step, mainly pig iron created, taken then to a forge where it was heated more and more of the impurities were removed. And then it would go on to blacksmiths and places where they would really make the finest iron objects. So I said that the Cumberland furnace was his first furnace. So he bought it in 1804. He operated it until 1825. So he operated it for 21 years. And it had subsequently had some pretty prominent owners. And also should have mentioned that he acquired about 10,000 acres, Bell did, around Cumberland Furnace. So it was surrounded by woods. And that was where he got the trees to make the charcoal from. So he sold it in 1825 to a man named Anthony Van Leer. And there have been a lot of Van Leers. In fact, there's a town in Dixon County called Van Leer. And that's named for the man who bought. Anthony Van Leer was also from Pennsylvania, actually from Chester County, Pennsylvania. And so he'd heard about Montgomery Bell. He was younger. And so he comes here hoping to get into the iron business. And so he buys the Cumberland furnace from Montgomery Bell and continues operating it for about 40 years. And then right after the Civil War, his granddaughter and her husband, who she had sort of scandalized the family by marrying a Union officer during the middle of the Civil War. And so his name was Drew Yard. And so Mr. and Mrs. Drew Yard continued to operate the Cumberland furnace very profitably for about 20 years after the Civil War. And then it went through a couple of owners, but the most notable of who operated it for about 30 years, beginning at the very end of the 19th century, and then for about the first 25 years of the 20th century, was a man named Joseph Warner. And if that name sounds familiar, it should, because he had two brothers named Edwin and Percy. And another thing that was fascinating about, another little piece of history about Joseph Warner was he established a home on Harding Road, almost directly across from MBA, called Overbrook, if that sounds familiar. And so he sold it, and I think he built it around 1914 and sold it to the Catholic Sisters.
Is that the White House on the Census City campus?
It is, Overbrook. And so that's the name of the elementary school too, Catholic elementary school there. But that was originally Joseph Warner's home. So going on, so he ended up in a patent dispute with somebody, Joseph Warner did, which depleted his resources. I guess he paid it to all his lawyers. And anyway, he had to get out of the business. And around 1940, right at the beginning of World War II, a man that you've probably heard of named Rogers Caldwell came into the picture. His company bought the furnace and operated it for about a year and a half during the middle of World War II, and was producing armaments that the Americans used in the war. And unfortunately, there were some problems that I wasn't able to really get a lot of detail about. But anyway, he ended up selling the furnace, and they just basically reduced it to scrap in 1943. And the Cumberland furnace, one of the interesting things about it is was the longest operating iron furnace in the United States in its history. So it really is quite a pretty significant iron furnace. And as you all probably know, there's a community called Cumberland Furnace located in northern Dixon County, which has been there for a long time and is still a community of about 3,600. Dixon County, I will say, has not done a very good job of making that open to the public. There's an iron museum there, which is not open to the public as far as I've been able to determine. The community has been placed on the National Register of Historic Places, but there are really a lot of sort of dilapidated buildings, like there's a train station, which could be fixed up and open to the public, and some other buildings that I think would make that community, the history of that community, come alive for the public. But so far that hasn't happened. And one of the things that I should have mentioned about Cumberland Furnace is that's pretty notable is that they produced cannonballs and other armament that was supplied to Andrew Jackson. and used in the Battle of New Orleans. So it has a historic significance. And Bell got to know Andrew Jackson slightly. I don't think they were bosom buddies, but as a result of, what Andrew Jackson obviously treasured was the fact that these cannonballs had really done their job. And so I think he felt they'd been well manufactured, and so he had a high opinion of Montgomery Bell, which Montgomery Bell called on him, as we'll talk about in just a minute. So that is not a not very easy to read slide of the Highland Rim. So his furnaces then, I'm just going to touch on them briefly. Cumberland furnace first. His second furnace was the Yellow Creek furnace located in southern Montgomery County, just north of Dixon County. The third was the Bellevue furnace. And so speaking of buildings that have been there a long time, this was originally part of his Bellevue furnace, and it was a storage shed. It's now the Rock Church of Christ. And there's a little marker, which you saw in the earlier picture, that says M. Bell, AD 1826. And so that's been there a very long time. And that Church of Christ, although it's a small church, is still has an active congregation today and meets every Sunday. So that's, I think, a pretty historical significance there. So a forge that he named Valley Forge, and there's speculation about why he picked that name. He grew up very close to the Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. Okay, here we go. Okay, so Valley Forge he had a forge, not a furnace, and this is in northern Dixon County also. And so that dam that you see that dammed up a stream called Jones Creek that was designed to create water power to operate his forge, you can see the dams have been breached, but it's still there, folks. It is still there, built around 1830. And the Valley Forge was one of his main facilities. And it is on private property. Fortunately, the owner of the property was very generous about telling us we could go there anytime. So I wish that, though, that Tennessee would perhaps erect a historic marker or something, because this was really one of his main iron facilities, the Valley Forge. So so James Worley was one of his slaves. He had actually become acquainted with James Worley, and I guess purchased him in Kentucky. So James Worley moved with Montgomery Bell to Tennessee. And, there are lots of stories about the relationship between the two men. I mean, there was clearly the master-slave relationship, but it was a lot more than that, because Montgomery Bell trusted James Worley to take his goods by boat to New Orleans, to Cincinnati. He was doing it on his own. Montgomery Bell was not with him. And so there was a trust there that probably didn't exist in many other similar relationships between master and enslaved person. And so by 1844, this was the last furnace that Montgomery Bell built, and he decided to name it for his, enslaved person that he trusted so much, James Worley. So this was the Worley furnace, and it continued operating after the Civil War into about the 1880s.
So he was trusted to travel without.
You can see what Bell had to say about him. A resident of New Orleans offered a large sum of money for Worley. Bell's reply was, not for all of New Orleans. So he did trust him. So this is an example of what Montgomery Bell was noted for, iron kettles. And they were used on a lot of southern plantations. And apparently they were, extremely finely made and were, one of the products that he sold. And I should have mentioned, he had retail stores as well as the iron furnaces and forges. He had retail stores in downtown Nashville where he sold the goods the cast iron goods that were made at his furnaces. Okay, so let's talk about the Narrows of the Harpeth. So many of you, I'm sure, have been out there to the Harpeth River State Park, and this is sort of shows the configuration of how the Harpeth bends around like that and creates what's called the narrows of the Harpeth. And so at different times of the year and during different times of rainfall, got several slides. So that's the entry to the tunnel that he created at the narrows of the Harpeth. This is the exit, and that would be what I would describe as sort of a normal water flow through the tunnel, which is still there now. In periods of high water, it really gushes through the tunnel even now. In periods of low water, not so much. And you can see that some adventurous folks do some rock climbing on the tunnel. So how did the tunnel come about? So this was where his enslaved workers, they did the work. And so this was before dynamite. Dynamite did not exist. And so the people that were creating this tunnel, which is about the length of a football field, about 100 yards through limestone rock, and they used basically just a hand drill that they would hammer on the drill. You can imagine how long that took. And I describe the process in the book of sort of how that worked. So it took about a year or more to create that tunnel through the limestone rock there at the narrows of the Harpeth. They had black powder. They did have black powder.
What about nitroglycerin?
I don't think so. I think they just had black powder. So it took a long time, and there was a lot of hard work that went into that. So he finished it around 1819. We don't know the exact time period that it took to build it, but around 1819. And so in those days, they called what we now call a recession a panic. And so the panic of 1819 occurred, and I think he was sort of running low on funds, and so he didn't build a forge there, which he eventually did, but he didn't do it initially. And so he held this tunnel and the land around it. He had persuaded the legislature to reserve about 10,000 acres around it in hopes that he could convince the federal government to build an armory there. That was his goal. And so he wrote his friend Andrew Jackson, asked for his help. Andrew Jackson wrote the then Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, and recommended. He said, "My friend Montgomery Bell will do a good job for you." And so I recommend that you consider this tract of land for the armory. But actually the armory, it turned out, wasn't built until the Civil War in Illinois. And so after about 10 years of waiting, he tried to convince the state legislature to build a prison there, and that didn't work. And so finally he decided to go ahead and build a forge, the Patterson Forge, which is what he used the water that flowed through that tunnel to power the water wheel that operated. The name Patterson was his mother's maiden name, by the way. And so it was operated until he operated it until he deeded the Patterson Forge and the Worley Furnace, which were his two most active operations at the beginning of the 1850s. He deeded those to his son-in-law, James Bell, who had married Evelina, his daughter. And James Bell was also his nephew. James Bell was the son of Patterson Bell, his brother. And so he was both his nephew and his son-in-law.
So would the wheel have been there at the outflow, or would there have been a chase?
The wheel was, I think, basically at the outflow and kind of to the right there. There's a description. I don't think I've got time to read the description, but on page 100 and 101 in the book, there's a very detailed description of exactly how this worked, and really, really a great description written by a man named Robert Dalton, who wrote an article in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly about that. Anyway, the land around the Patterson Forge and the narrows of the Harpeth changed hands several times after the Civil War. And finally, a man that you all will know his name, certainly, Justin Potter, acquired it and created. He was very active in the Boy Scouts. And so he created a Boy Scout camp there at the narrows of the Harpeth, which he operated for a number of years. And that's where, in 1978, the state bought the property and created what's now Harpeth River State Park. And so this shows the farm that is directly across the Harpeth. You can see the Harpeth there in the foreground. And that's where Montgomery Bell is buried. He's buried, he wanted to be buried near the Patterson Forge. And so he's buried on a piece of property that, interestingly, is owned by a man named Wesley Haynes, who owns a very attractive farm there and maintains the cemetery. Buried in the cemetery are only Montgomery Bell and two of his granddaughters. And it's private property, so it's not, readily accessible to the public. But it's so close to the Patterson Forge, and that's the way he wanted it, because he treasured that place so much. So he was also a land developer. He built a subdivision which he called Belleville, and unfortunately there's no historic markers or anything that show it. It's where the Harpeth enters the Cumberland. It's at the mouth of the Harpeth, and there's a Corps of Engineers recreation area called Pardue Recreation area located there now, where Belleville used to be. So one of the most interesting investments he made was in a spa in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Harrodsburg. It's a fairly well-known town of historic significance in central Kentucky, Mercer County, Kentucky. And so the spa was called the Greenville Springs, and there's a great historic marker there. Bell invested in it in 1809 and continued his investment until the 1820s. This tells a little bit about the history. And interestingly, the property where the spa was became a women's college called the Daughters College and Young Ladies College. And there's now an inn called the Beaumont Inn, which is open to the public, kind of a bed and breakfast type place. So now we're going to talk about his religion. So he was a Presbyterian, a dyed-in-the-wool Presbyterian, and he belonged to the First Presbyterian Church, now the downtown Presbyterian Church, but during his lifetime it was the First Presbyterian Church. And a little bit of the history of the church there. And so this man was his minister, the Reverend John Todd Edgar. And he was the minister at the First Presbyterian Church for 27 years during the entire time that Montgomery Bell was a regular member and attendee there. And John Todd Edgar had a deep impact, as far as I could tell, on Montgomery Bell's thinking about slavery. And he basically, I think, convinced Montgomery Bell that he needed to consider emancipating his slaves. And he convinced him. And so I give this man the credit for Montgomery Bell deciding that emancipation was the right course of action. Another little historical footnote, you may recognize that lady as Adelicia Ackland. And so the historian for the First Presbyterian Church made me aware of this. He looked in the church minutes because he'd heard that this was the case. So Montgomery Bell and Adelicia Ackland were admitted as members of the First Presbyterian Church on the same day in 1846. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So this slide shows Liberia. So let's talk about Liberia and the American Colonization Society. So Montgomery Bell indeed tried to find another location where, when he decided to emancipate his enslaved workers, that they could go and have a new life. And so he sent his nephew to southern Illinois and southern Ohio to try to scout out and find tracts of land that Montgomery Bell could buy and send his emancipated workers to. And there was no interest on the part of the whether political officials or landowners in Illinois or in Ohio. And they just said, we don't want your folks, don't send them here. And so I think he realized from that experience that the American Colonization Society had created Liberia in the early 1820s, and they chartered ships to take, voluntarily emancipated slaves who somebody would pay the cost of their voyage to go to Liberia, and they settled in Liberia. And so so Montgomery Bell's decision to send his slaves that he emancipated there was motivated by two things. First, he couldn't find a place in the United States that would accept them, where he could buy land to send them. And secondly, interestingly, Liberia was rich in iron ore. And so he felt that perhaps his emancipated slaves could start their own iron furnace using skills that they had used while working at his iron furnaces. And so that happened, actually. There's evidence that the first group, which was headed by one of the slaves that he trusted a great deal, who also had a large family, named Tom Scott. And so Tom Scott and his family indeed started an iron furnace in Liberia and sent to Montgomery Bell around 1854 a bar of iron that had been made at this iron furnace in Liberia. There's evidence in letters that he wrote to the American Colonization Society executive director that he intended to emancipate all of his slaves. He did emancipate more than 100, but he had planned to send another group on a boat in the winter of 1854, 1855. And he was not in good health at that point. And that they didn't have enough money to charter the ship, so it didn't go. And so, unfortunately, he died in April of 1855. And so there was about 100 of his slaves that he had not emancipated yet that were not able to go, although I'm convinced that from the letters I've read that his intention was to emancipate them. So in his will, this is the cemetery that he's buried in that I mentioned, and there are a couple of smaller stones for his two granddaughters that are buried there. Nice obelisk. So this was his lawyer who drafted his will, Francis Fogg. You may be familiar with that name, Hume Fogg High School. He was very active in education, the Board of Education in Nashville. And there's a nice marker outside Hume Fogg High School now. So Francis Fogg was Montgomery Bell's lawyer, no question about it. His name shows up on many of the court cases that I saw evidence of. So and I think that Francis Fogg, in addition to Reverend John Todd Edgar, was one of the people that had the greatest influence on him. So in his will, he left $20,000 to endow, to create a school that he said in his will would be called Montgomery Bell Academy Forever. So he was not at all shy about associating his name with something that he was leaving his money to create. He left $1,000, and $20,000, by the way, translates into about $700,000 now. And it wasn't used immediately to create the school because of the Civil War intervening. And so after it had been well invested, even during the Civil War. Yes, sir?
John, didn't he specifically say it was for poor people?
He did, and that's a little bit of a misunderstood concept. He wanted the money to be invested and the interest to be used for that purpose, for poor children, but he didn't want the school to be only for poor children. He wanted the interest from the money that he left and would be invested to be used to pay the tuition of children whose parents could not afford to pay it, but parents who could afford to pay it would pay tuition. And from the very beginning, that's the way the school's been operated. And I won't mention names, but I know of two people that have been to MBA in what is basically my era in the 60s and 70s, who were students whose tuition was paid with money that was left over from Montgomery Bell School. So it continues to be used by the school in that manner. He also left $1,000, which $35,000 in today's money, for his church. And then the rest of his estate, and this is fascinating to me, the rest of his estate, this shows his devotion to his siblings and to his family. The rest of his estate was to be everything sold off, the money pooled, and then divided into 8 equal shares. One of his siblings did not have children, but the other 8 did. They were all dead by the time he died. And so he wanted basically his nieces and nephews and grandnieces and grandnephews to be the beneficiaries of the rest of his estate. And so it took, in the pre-internet days, it took his executors quite a bit of time to track down the location of all those folks, all those nieces and nephews, but they did, and the money was distributed in that manner. Now, in terms of children, there are 2 known children. Evelina, he was not married. He had a daughter named Evelina who was born to a woman named Patsy Moss. That's as much as I've been able to learn. Even the family members that have done a lot of genealogical research haven't been able to find any more. The family lore, which may or may not be true, was that she was the daughter of a Methodist minister who did not want her to marry this guy, Montgomery Bell. And so, but she did bear his daughter, Evelina. And Montgomery Bell took responsibility for raising Evelina. She attended what was then the sort of the Harpeth Hall of, high school in Nashville, called the Nashville Female Academy. Very, very elite, good institution. And so she did well. There's a newspaper article about her giving a recital in French. And there was a French scholar there who complimented her and her other 2 classmates that gave this recitation in French. So she was apparently very bright. I think he married her off. He married her off to James Bell, his nephew, son of Patterson, his brother Patterson. And so James Bell became his son-in-law as well as his nephew. And so James and Evelina had 13 children between them, 10 of whom lived to adulthood. And so there are many, many descendants from those various branches of the family. And I've, in writing the book, had the opportunity to talk with several of them. They gather the 3rd Sunday in September at a church, the Craggy Hope Methodist Church in Kingston Springs. And there's usually about 20 or 30 descendants that show up. So they're a somewhat organized group of people, which I think is kind of neat. He also had a daughter named Lucy. Lucy was born to an enslaved woman named Patsy also. Lucy married a man named Andrew Jackson Pardue and lived in Cheatham County. I should say Cheatham County didn't exist in Montgomery Bell's lifetime. It was actually created the year after he died. But Lucy lived, and she had 7 children, lived in Ashland City. And at her death, her son provided the information for the death certificate, which listed Montgomery Bell as her father. So that's where that information comes from. On Ancestry.com, the children descended from Lucy are traced to some extent. I wouldn't say it's comprehensive, but there are a number of descendants. And included among those are the Sweats. And you all, I'm sure, are familiar with Sweat's restaurant here in Nashville, but founded by Walter Sweat in 1954. And anyway, the Sweats are direct descendants of Montgomery Bell. And Michael Sweat, who I had the privilege of talking with and meeting during the course of my research, is a graduate of Montgomery Bell Academy, 2006, and teaches math now at MBA and has for the last 6 years. So anyway, there's a kind of a nice tie between the Sweat family and Montgomery Bell. So you all are, I think we're about to run out of time here. You're familiar with some of the other things named for him, the state park. Here's something I didn't know. So Bell's Bend, in the northwestern part of Davidson County, is named for Montgomery Bell. And the reason, most people don't know that, the reason it's named for him is because he bought 6,000 acres in 1817 and owned it until 1850. And essentially, most of the peninsula, that is Bell's Bend, was owned by Montgomery Bell for over 30 years. And he built, there is a home there. We'll run through a couple more slides here. That's Evelina, Montgomery Bell State Park. The Civilian Conservation Corps is responsible for most of the construction there. There's an M. Bell Trail. The Laurel Furnace, located in the park, was built by one of his competitors, Mr. Napier. And so, but even though it was friendly competition, because he sold a lot of the iron produced at the Laurel Furnace to Patterson Forge. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church was founded in what's now Montgomery Bell State Park, and there's a chapel there. Okay, Montgomery Bell Bridges, this is Highway 49, and there's an interesting story. In 1930, a bridge over the Cumberland River was built, and the legislature named it the Montgomery Bell Bridge. And so about 4 miles up the road on Highway 49, the road crossed the Harpeth River, and there was no bridge at the time they built this bridge over the Cumberland. So a year or two later, they got federal funds to build a bridge over the Harpeth River. And so eventually, although not when it was initially built, it became referred to as the Montgomery Bell Bridge. And so you had 2 Montgomery Bell bridges within 4 miles of each other, which I thought was kind of neat. They rebuilt the bridge over the Cumberland, and it's now called the Veterans Memorial Bridge, but the bridge over the Harpeth is still the Montgomery Bell Bridge. Some shots of NBA, Bell's Bend. Okay, I wanted to show you this. So when you go to Bell's Bend Park, a Metro Park located in Bell's Bend, just past the visitor center for the park, you'll see this house. It kind of sits back from the road. And so this house, built around 1840, still in fairly good shape, was built by Montgomery Bell. It's called the John Bell House, and the ranger there, Lynn Ann Welch, and I have talked quite a bit about why it's called the John Bell House, and she's like, not sure. And my speculation is that John Bell, who was another of Montgomery Bell's nephews, was in business with him, and that he also lived there for a period of time. But there are several deeds and advertisements in the newspaper in which Montgomery Bell was advertising land for sale, and he stated that he was a resident of about 6 miles from Nashville, which is downtown Nashville, which is where Bell's Bend is located, and that he lived there. So I'm convinced that this was the house that he lived in. And so there was, he had, and the other thing that makes me convinced of that is he had a sawmill and a grist mill located on the Cumberland River about a half a mile from this house. And it's on land that's now owned by the Harpeth Valley Utility District, that is their sewage treatment facility. And so this guy from the utility district was nice enough to, they had a environmental survey done of their property at the time they acquired it back, I think around 2010 or so. And so they found a lot of artifacts of Bell's Mill located in the vicinity of where the mill was located. So that was kind of neat. And there was, during the Civil War, during 1864 in December, which would have been about 9 years after Montgomery Bell's death, at Bell's Mill, the Confederates set up on the bluff there and fired on Union boats bringing supplies to the Union troops in Nashville on the Cumberland River. And they did it for about 2 weeks before the actual Battle of Nashville took place. And it's referred to as the Battle of Bell's Mill, which took place just sporadic firing by Confederates on the Union ships coming through there. Bell's Bend Park. And then finally, I'll close on this note. So this is the Halliburton Tower that sits on the Rhodes College campus in Memphis. And so the Rhodes College, which used to be Southwestern at Memphis when I was in high school, I had some classmates that went there. So Southwestern at Memphis was actually started in 1849 in Clarksville. And it was called, initially, there was a high school there, and they decided to expand it into a college, and the Masons took it on as a project. And so it was called the Montgomery Masonic College in 1849. And so in order to get it started and to hire faculty, they had to raise money. So they went to the ironmasters, of whom Montgomery Bell was one of several. And that was another example of him giving money for the creation of an educational institution. He would have been about 80 when that happened. And so don't know how much he gave, but sometime after that, while the school was still in Clarksville, it was in Clarksville, it became Stewart's College and then Southwestern. And then in 1924, and I didn't, this is another little fact I learned, Memphis had no four-year college at that time. And so they were really wanting to have one. So they basically seduced, the Southwestern people to move their entire campus to Memphis, where it's been in 1924. And so it's been there ever since, same location in Memphis. And so it was, as I said, Southwestern, and then became Rhodes, named after a former president of the college. But before it moved, there was a marble slab that somebody commissioned to recognize the generosity of the ironmasters that had given the money to found Montgomery Masonic College in 1849. And so that marble slab, when they built Halliburton Tower in 1962, they built the slab into the side of the building. And unfortunately, it sits about 60 or 70 feet up from the ground. And so when you're walking along on the campus, you can't really see it except with binoculars. But anyway, so this is a picture, though, of what it looks like. And so I talked with, again, my friend Rick Hollis, who I've mentioned, told me about this. And so I went to see it myself and took a picture with a telephoto lens, but still it wasn't very good. And so I contacted Rhodes College and said, do you all have any pictures of this slab? And frankly, I'm not sure the guy knew what I was talking about, but he quickly found out. And so he dispatched a drone to take a picture of it. And so that's the picture. And you can see Montgomery Bell, can't read it too well, but Montgomery Bell's name is the very first one of about 8 names of ironmasters that gave money to start the college in Clarksville. That is now Rhodes College in Memphis. So he was clearly a person that valued education and educational institutions. And I think in many ways it was because he had no education, no formal education. When he grew up, he was homeschooled through the courtesy of his siblings and his parents. But he obviously grew up to be a pretty smart man. So that's all I've got. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I've always got a question. Was he akin to either the John Bell, the 19th century politician, or John Bell, of the Bell Witch fame?
I'm glad you asked that question. The answer to both is no. John Bell was a pretty common name.
When you mentioned Bell's pen, what about Ray Bell?
Excuse me, when I asked several people, do you, after I had learned that it was named for Montgomery Bell, I said, do you know who Bell's pen is named for? And most times people said Ray Bell. I thought it was named for Ray Bell, but I don't think they're kin. I don't know that for sure. Ray Bell is deceased now, but I don't think he's a descendant.
The Southwestern campus in Clarksville is now Austin Peay.
It is now Austin Peay State University. It is. And there's actually a historic marker on the campus that traces the history like I've done of the names. Any other questions?
This isn't a question.
Okay.
I want to thank you for this presentation. I've lived in Davidson County my whole life and knew nothing about the history of Dixon County except Montgomery Bell. I knew a little bit about Montgomery Bell. They really need to do a better job of it.
A better job could always be done. That's for sure. So if anybody would like to buy a book, it's being sold. Tracy will take care of you. and I hope you will.